Hi, this is Ryan with Generational Talk. So, we've had many discussions about baby boomers and millennials, but there's a generation in between them that often gets left out of the conversation. That's Generation X. Join us for a discussion on Generation Jones, which is the cohort that transitioned into Generation X. There's a lot to unpack there. So, watch the conversation, watch the video, and subscribe to this channel so you can learn more about them and X.
I'm Kelly Casey. I was born in 1965.
I'm Amy Bell, and I was also born in 1965.
My name's Kifflie. I was born in 1961.
My name is Steve Barrera. I was born in 1966.
I am Sherry Lenhart, and I think, checking out the dates here, I think by Strauss and Howe standards, I might be the only core Xer. I don't know. I was born in 1970.
Paul, you've been with us for a couple episodes now. You were with us for the Christian Left episode. So you were born in 1981. I'm going to let you explain more about yourself, but just wanted to set that up. Go on, Paul.
Well, what got me involved in generational theory is I watched a Simpson episode, and it was all about Gen X. And I was like, what happened? Nobody talks about Gen X anymore. And so that's what I started to look into it, just started searching and stuff. So yeah, I mean, as an 81er, we definitely got mixed signals about youth. I feel like I have one foot in the on the Xer side of the street where I can at least understand what's going on, like what their point of view is. So I don't know if I completely get every little aspect of it, but it is a part of who I am too, is just really having an appreciation for Generation X.
You and I were pretty much born in the same week in 1981.
Yep.
In June. So it's amazing how much commonality we both have with each other.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I wore glasses today just to add
changing it up. Changing it up. And so also Darius, I'm with Darius and Tommy, my co-host. They'll have questions too. But I want to start out with so in 1991, Doug Copeland released Generation X, Tales for the Accelerated Culture. A Boston Globe quote from Copeland says, "I just want to show society what people born after 1960 think about things. We're sick of stupid labels, we're sick of being marginalized in lousy jobs, and we're tired of hearing about ourselves from others." Pew Research dates Xers between 1965 to 1980. Strauss and Howe, the creators of the fourth turn-in theory and the millennial name, dates Xers between 1961 and 81. First off, what do you guys think about those dates? Which one do you believe reflects Xers the most?
If you'd like, I could answer that. I really think that Strauss and Howe got it right. I think the generations are not only about demographics and about numbers, but about psychology. And I think there is a definite difference between people born in the early 1960s versus people born in the 50s. It's just, going back to high school and watching the high school seniors talk about things, they were much more political, and the rest of us were like, where's the next party?
That's funny. Paul, how do you feel about that? Because I remember things started to get political again with us, especially as we got closer to the 2000 election.
Yeah, I wasn't really, because I was in a small town, and at the time I was a very conservative person. So I wasn't super political myself, but you kind of saw some of that in entertainment, where the Xers were more worried about more on the survival things, and the millennials would be involved in some sort of cause, whether it was small or big, for their school or whatever. The dates wise, I think they're pretty close. In the Four Turning book, I think they refer to the class of 2000 as the dividing line, and I was in the class of 2000, even though I'm born in 81. And so that group was targeted to be a more civic generation, and that was like a reaction to what maybe silence and boomers didn't like about Generation X, which makes me kind of feel sorry that for Generation X, that almost all the communication from society at large was that you're not good enough. And you had like a
Or
lot
you're
of
extreme, or you're extreme.
you're extreme. Yeah, that was the 90s.
Extreme.
But John Hughes, whenever I look back, I didn't realize how many movies were John Hughes movies. And like just that kind of thing is, I really think he captured the feeling of it, of Gen X. Breakfast Club, because I kind of saw that in my own high school when I was in younger high school, is that like the different groups, they either didn't get along or didn't even acknowledge each other. I went to a small school, so there was only a couple groups, but still there was like, oh, you're either a sports kid or you're not.
How was childhood for the Xer?
It was, you were on your own as a child. You were given no guidance. But maybe in a positive way of saying it, you should do what you want. You should, you're in charge of your own life and you can decide what's best for you and just do it. So on the positive side, you have that autonomy, but then on the negative side, you have that complete lack of guidance and, no structure to your childhood at all.
Exactly. I remember teachers in school, like grade school and middle school, I'd be like, oh, do I have to do that? And they're like, no, you don't have to do anything. It's your choice. Whether you want to do it, it's your consequences. It's like, cool, see ya, on the beach, so there was no, like Steve was saying, there was no guidance, no guidelines, there was no bumper pads. It was kind of like, woo, let's go for it. At least in my world. But
and many Gen Xers did indeed choose to go with sort of what felt good for them and what made them happy, but then they discovered later as they got older that, they probably should have been thinking about more practical things like, how am I going to survive? I do need to have an income. I do need to have some foundation for my life as I get older, because sooner or later you have no one left to look out for you, and then you have to be self-sufficient.
Right,
Sure.
and I remember in my 20s having that, sinking sand feeling, like the sand was just sinking beneath me because there was no foundation, there was nothing, and it just dropped.
Are you talking about the 1960s and 70s and the 80s? Basically, culturally, there wasn't a foundation, or more just?
I think for our generation, I don't know if culturally there wasn't a foundation. I mean, the boomers had a foundation, and I think their personality-wise, just the way they were raised and everything. And you guys have talked as millennials, how you felt like you activist and all of that, but we were kind of like, yeah, go ahead, do what you want. And I know my parents were pretty much absent for a number of reasons. And they were a silent generation.
Silent generation?
Yeah.
Sure, you had boomer parents?
I had core boomer parents, which, I was born in 1970. My mom was 19 when she had me, and she married, I've never met my biological father. I know who he is, but he opted out. And so my mom married when I was about 2.5, and he adopted me. So when I refer to my dad, that's the man I'm talking about, is the man who adopted me. It made me a bit of an anomaly in my neighborhood. And sometimes I was kind of self-conscious about how young my parents were. And sometimes it was kind of cool, because they were young and they were cute and they were hip and all that sort of thing. Would I describe them as more protective? Not entirely. They let me experience visually just about everything. I could watch what I want. I could listen to what I want. No topics were taboo. But I didn't have this social freedom, I think, in my adolescent years that my friends who had silent parents had.
Yeah,
So.
I pick up on that and what everyone else is saying. I had a silent mom too. I was raised by a single mom and my maternal grandparents. And I think we got away with a lot, but in looking back on it, I think I always kind of had the feeling, at least with the people my age, because most of their parents were pre-baby boomers, you know, they were silent, or maybe even in some cases GIs. And I just think that our parents were just so out of touch with what was going on in the world, because like I said, before baby boomers, and they grew up in this world where it was just so much more innocent, that they were just clueless. I don't think that, you know, that was the feeling I always got, that they had no idea what we were doing.
Right.
It wasn't so much that they were just, you know, not wanting to be a parent, or just, you know, absentee parenting. It was just, they were just clueless as to what was happening. So we got away with a lot because of it.
Naive. I think
they were naive. It never even crossed their minds that their kids might be smoking pot. I mean, that was just not, that was just, so I think that kind of played into it too. And that wasn't really their fault. It's like Sherry said, It was the naivety of it.
Okay.
They were so naive. And I remember, you know, and that was, you know, somewhat different too, is my friends would come to my house and my parents were there. My parents were always there. They were there, but they were very engaging. And they would talk with my friends. And again, you know, sometimes I didn't appreciate it. As an adult now, looking back, I appreciate it. But in the moment, you're like, you know, can I have some boundaries here? Is there anything? But nothing was off the table. They would talk about anything, to the point that I was horrified. But then I'd find myself in conversations with my friends outside of the context of my parents' home, and something would come up and they'd be like, oh my gosh, you talk to your parents about drugs? Do you mean to tell me that your parents talk to you about sex? You know, that sort of thing. And I thought, well, yeah, none of my friends had that experience. And I would go as far as saying, even in my peer group, they didn't have that kind of candid conversation going on in their homes at all times. And my brother and sister and I still joke about it. They were like, oh my gosh, you know, mom and dad, they would talk about anything, anywhere, in front of anyone. And my peers definitely did not have that.
I don't think my parents were so much naive, especially I look back on their pictures, and, you know, my grandmother, by the time I came along, she had found religion. But before religion, she was a party animal, you know, in 1920s flapper and the whole bit. And, you know, my parents as well, they knew what was there. And I'm a recovering alcoholic. So when I had to tell my parents, hey, I'm going into rehab, my mother, it put her to bed for 3 days, because in her mind, an alcoholic was somebody, you know, a bum laying in the gutter, not her 20-year-old daughter. And I'm like, no, Mom, alcoholism now is described as a disease. It's not a defect of character. So I think a lot of what informed their worldviews was these old ideas. Like I remember when my mom found my sister's birth control pills. And, you know, she freaked out because she was Catholic and you don't use birth control, but she didn't want her daughters to get pregnant. And she's like, you know, that was her reality too. So, yeah, it's not that they didn't know. I really think that they didn't want to know, because they would have it would just put a whole nother level of complications, that they just didn't have the energy after the Depression and World War II and going through all of that. They just didn't have the energy.
So when Will Smith, his song, Parents Just Don't Understand, came out, was it basically a reference to parents choosing not to understand? You said they didn't want to know.
I don't know that song.
I don't either.
Tell it. Good. I need that to come out.
I do know that song.
It's
Exactly.
Baby. But I actually wanted to kind of talk about that a little bit, just being on the other end of it.
Okay.
Is that the critical mass of the generation? I never told my parents anything, even though they wanted to know. My mom still jokes about it today. Like I had like a banquet that I was in for a club, and it was National Honor Society, something you should probably tell your parents about. And I was in National Honor Society the whole year, and I didn't tell her till the day of the banquet. It was just like, I was independent enough that, because of probably being a latchkey kid and just, even though they were there, they weren't there all the time. That I didn't think that they needed to know things I could handle myself.
I wonder how much is that his personality and generationally. I mean, we have similar personality, and my parents definitely cared. They wanted to know, but I just I didn't feel like it was. I had to tell them.
And if you can, I have a younger brother and sister, and they tell my parents. I was like, why do you tell them that?
The closeness of our
Yep, I remember when I was, I think I was 25 years old, and I was living in my own apartment, and I had made the decision to move in with my then boyfriend, who is now my husband, and I waited until the last minute to tell my parents that I was going on, and I was a little nervous about telling them, and they said, well, okay, if that's really what you want to do, and then they just left it like that.
But see, that's the difference. I don't think our parents would ever leave it. If once they're involved, Paul, they're involved.
They weren't involved. They weren't involved at all. I rented the moving van, and I had a friend help me. They had nothing to do with moving me. That was all me.
So I'm hogging up the hosting space here. Darius.
Yeah, of course, I'm the 1994 millennial in the group. So my parents, they're 1961 and 1966. And so that what you guys are saying tracks pretty well with what they've told me, which was basically that they would leave the house and their parents just like come home before the sun sets. Other than
rises.
Yeah, right. Just stay out of trouble, and I'll pretty much leave you to your own devices. And like Kelly was saying, I mean, it's not so much that they didn't know they were, drinking or, in my mom's case, going somewhere pretty far away with their friends and then coming back. But I think there's a show on Netflix, Stranger Things, that comes to mind when you guys talking here about just walking in the house and your parents always being there. I think they do a pretty good job at portraying what you guys have described here.
Yeah, definitely. And you said one of your parents was born in 1966, Darius?
Yes, my mom.
Yeah, that's the same year I was born. And yeah, I ran around and did whatever I wanted. But I just wanted to add that I was actually not a latchkey kid because my parents stayed together, and my mom was a stay-at-home mom. And I think that actually, I knew a lot of people my age whose parents were divorced, and I could tell that it made a difference. That like my life was better because my parents stayed together, and because I always felt like I had a family, even if my parents weren't so connected to me in terms of my upbringing.
Was divorce an odd concept when you were kids?
No, I know a lot of people with divorced parents.
I was going to say Generation X was kind of that first generation maybe where it kind of became more normal for a lot of kids to have divorced parents. Accurate?
I mean, my mom was late 30s when she had me. My dad was early 40s. So, and again, the Catholic background, divorce was a no-no. My mom, disowned one of her friends for getting a divorce, one of her best friends, and just, and, which didn't help us kids because every single one of us grew up and ended up divorced. So it's like, gee, Mom, thanks for that. So whenever there was a friend who was coming from a divorced home, there was always a little bit of like, there's something wrong there, which again,
I think for me, my parents got divorced when I was 9, and it wasn't that it was like some unheard of thing. I mean, there was people, that would have been around 1974, so divorce was becoming a little more common. I'm not going to say it wasn't traumatic. Of course it was traumatic, for any kid who goes through that. But I don't think I felt like I was a total oddball because that had happened, because it was starting to become more of an acceptable thing to do by that time. So, and then within the coming years, after that, it was almost, people who had parents that were still married seemed to be the minority.
Well,
That's what I was actually going to ask Steve that. I wondered because I remember my freshman year in college when we all began talking about our families, people being taking note that my parents were still together. They would say things, you know, like, oh, wow, your parents are still married. So I think there was an element of feeling somewhat in the minority. Steve, did you have that experience at all?
Maybe a little bit, yeah. But because my parents were still married, and it was unusual. Yeah.
One of the things I noticed, society divorce early on, because it really became normal in the 60s and 70s, right? They didn't really think about what happened to the kids. So divorces were could be a lot nastier, or at least nasty divorces were more common. Like people fighting over kids, maybe even kidnapping kids if they didn't get custody. Whereas like as millennials, their parents were getting divorced.
Mm-hmm.
It became more of a like, hey, we need to make sure that we make this transition from us being together to us being apart, something that the kids can handle, and they started to actually consider the kids' feelings and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't know, like, I'm not being the interviewer, but I wanted to know like what it felt like during that time getting divorced. Did you feel like you were just in the way, or what did you feel like?
Well, I've heard them say that kids often blame themselves. I didn't do that. I didn't feel like it was my fault that my parents got divorced. I kind of understood why they got divorced, and it didn't have anything to do with me. But my parents did have one of those ugly 70s divorces. I mean, really, really ugly. And I had zero contact with my dad for 7 years. I didn't know where he was. He didn't know where I was. And that was painful. It was definitely painful. And the relationship, I think because we missed so much of those years, because I was a little girl the last time I saw him. And then when I saw him again, I was getting ready to graduate from high school. I think that it permanently damaged our relationship. We tried, we tried to have a closer relationship when we did reunite, but it just never really happened.
Paul, you mentioned how things changed by the time, we were kids. And I guess I'm on the other side of that. My parents divorced by the time I was 3, but it's pretty much, that's how life was. I don't remember them ever being together. I didn't see the dark side of divorce. They always played nice in front of me. Together, when they were together, they played nice. Both sides of the families were still close. When my stepdad came into the scene, my biological dad's family welcomed him. So I guess I think by the time I came of age, everyone basically, like you said, worked together to make sure life for the kid was smooth during the transition. At least that's my personal experience.
Yeah, it became more like a conversation of what does this do to kids, and like especially like in the conservative areas, they're like, we have to make sure divorce isn't ruining the children, because I think a lot of the people blamed what they saw as the lacking things of Gen X on divorce is what I saw as a kid, is that people were saying, oh, divorce has just ruined this generation. And I don't think Generation X is ruined, but that was a lot of the societal chatter was like that.
In response to the way that you guys were raised, how do you feel that there were things that you admired about the way your parents raised you that you guys wanted to continue, and were there things that you thought could have been done better that you tried to improve on? How do you think that the parenting style that you received as a child impacted your parenting style, and what, in terms of what you tried to borrow from and what you tried to change?
I have two kids, both core millennials, 91 and a 94. I tried to, my parents did teach me how to be independent, and I did try to impose that on my kids. I mean, you know, how to get your own checking account, how to take care of your car, how to do simple household tasks. And I think I managed to, you know, both of my kids can cook well. In fact, my son cooks very well. And maybe some of the things I did differently, what we did differently is that we were probably a little more involved with them as far as, you know, school, and we both went to the parent-teacher conferences. We both went to all their graduations, made sure that we were there. I remember when I finished grad school, my parents did not come to that graduation.
Wow, interesting.
Yeah. So, I mean, we were somewhat more involved. I think I tried consciously to balance between being a little more there for them, but also trying to make sure that they could be fairly independent. I think I succeeded.
Sorry, I just really quickly, because that's something that I never even thought about. I kind of just assumed it was always natural for everybody to go to graduations. Was that not the case in certain people's experiences where parents or only one parent showed up to a graduation?
I was the youngest of, 6 kids, and one of who had died, which added a whole nother emotional layer to everything. So I remember going to my older siblings' graduations. It was they were all definitely boomers, and they were quite a bit older than me. But by the time I came along, well, I actually dropped out of high school, so the graduation I had was kind of a faux graduation. So my parents were like, okay. They showed up, and this was pretty much my feel throughout high school. They showed up when they were forced to, when they felt like, okay, I guess we got to do this now. So, for me, it was just never a thing. Although they have said that they're very proud of me, and, as I went on to college and getting my degrees and everything. And there was a lot of pride there. And so they didn't neglect that side of it, but showing up was not something that they did very well.
I was such a rebel when I was a teen that I didn't go to my graduation. My parents didn't pressure me to or insist that I do that.
Wow. Yeah, there was that too. No, my mom and my grandparents, my maternal grandparents, came to my graduation. My dad, who I had, reunited with at that point, did not. I don't think he even considered it. But they didn't make a big deal out of it. It's not like they threw me a graduation party or anything. We went, I walked, I got my diploma, and that was it. Right. That was it.
Graduation party? What's that?
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. We didn't have graduation parties when I was in high school. I mean, we all went out afterwards.
Yeah,
but we didn't have a party at home.
Friends. Yeah, but we didn't. There was no cake, no relic. No, they didn't do that.
I feel like less of an Xer now because I.
Yeah, this is beautiful. It's beautiful.
I'm sorry.
Go on, Tommy.
I was just gonna say, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, because I am very interested to hear about your guys' parenting styles, but that was just something that I was just so surprised to hear that, like it wasn't necessarily normal for parents to show up to graduations. Wow. Yeah.
My parents didn't come to my wedding. They didn't come to my wedding.
Oh my gosh.
And it wasn't that they didn't approve. My mom wanted to, because we went to, my ex-husband now went to Las Vegas to get married. So we lived in Los Angeles. So Las Vegas wasn't a big deal. But my older sister had planned on being in Las Vegas that weekend anyway. And my parents had to babysit her kids. And my older sister wanted to get another babysitter. So my parents didn't come to my wedding so that she could babysit Mary's kids.
I didn't have any.
I still have resentment over that one.
I didn't have any family at my wedding either, because we just decided to get married, and we were living in Alaska at the time. And my mom, you know, she said, well, I can come up there. And I was just kind of like, no, you don't need to. It's no big deal. We're just going to go get married. So don't worry about it. So,
Wow.
yeah.
Sherry,
Yeah.
you're a core Xer. I mean, is this the Xer experience, or is it an individual thing?
You know, I'm processing this. I've always noticed that there's a distinct difference between Xers born in the 60s and Xers born in the 70s. And as somebody born in 1970, I feel like I kind of have one leg in each world. The Xers born, let's say, after 1972, had a much more sort of a sitcom-y existence. You know, even if the parents were divorced, there was still a wholesomeness that I think existed that didn't exist quite as much with cores. But then for people born, let's say 1966 and earlier, they were definitely there. I would say, going into my memories here as a 13-year-old, 14-year-old, they were a little rowdier. They were more underprotected than we were.
The 70s Xers were rowdier than the 80s kids, by the way.
I'm sure.
Felt like Lord of the Flies with the 70s Xers.
Gosh. I hated that book. Graduations, all of that sort of thing. And now I'm wondering if it's regional. I grew up suburban. And parents were definitely present at graduations. I almost want to say, and I don't know if this is accurate, it's just a feeling, but I almost want to say that growing up suburban Chicago, a child's achievements were very much an extension of what the parents did. Whether or not the parents were aggressive or assertive or compassionate presences in the child's life, whatever the child did, especially age 16 and beyond, the parents saw as a reflection of their own successes. So for those kids who were going to graduate, you know, with honors, or they were going to graduate high school well, or they were going to graduate college, parents were very, very present. But there was a decided, I'm overusing the word, but I'm going to say it again. There was a presentation to the parents, like, I'm going to dress a certain way, and this is my child. And it was, again, they were just like a trophy almost. That was more my experience graduating 8th grade, graduating high school, going into college, how parents kind of saw their kids. Most specifically, again, we're going into parents who were older than my own, parents who were born, say, 1945 and earlier, or kind of within the World War II era.
So you mentioned sitcom-y and presentation.
Yeah.
So this is a good way to work in John Hughes. It seems like the stereotype is that John Hughes depicted the Xer situation. Is that true for you guys? Do you feel represented by the depiction in his films?
I don't know if John Hughes did Fast Times at Ridgemont High, but that was my high school. Was Fast Times at Ridgemont High. Yes. That and because I was in Los Angeles, American Graffiti, although that took place like 20 years prior to when I got there, but that same, you know, doing cruising and all of that, the drugs and the, you know, the party lifestyle, Fast Times at Ridgemont High.
That's Amy Hecklerin. I believe she did Clueless.
Yeah, she did.
So yeah, she did Fast Times.
I would say Fast Times. Well, first of all, no, the John Hughes stuff. No, I felt like that was written about younger people.
Me too.
That was not my experience. So,
in a couple episodes,
I guess Fast Times would probably be the closest if I had to pick one. Although I don't know that
you picked Dazed and Confused. Dazed and
Huh?
Confused and
Yeah, I watched that
Still
one
another.
time, and I'm like, because someone said, well, maybe this was your teenage experience, and I'm like, okay, well, I'll find out. And well, yeah, kind of, sorta. I don't know. I don't know, and maybe it's because the John Hughes movies depicted more suburban kids that their experience was not exactly the same as.
I feel like they were younger. They would be kids.
But they were younger. I mean, I felt like when a lot of the Molly Ringwald, all that stuff, I was already an adult by that time.
Exactly. I had children by the time Breakfast Club.
Yeah, I was married and an adult, and it was like, okay, so they're talking about, somebody else.
Although I did see the cliques in high school. The cliques were kind of right on from Breakfast Club. But they, I guess, because I was the stoner in high school, so I didn't care,
We had one clique, the stoner, everyone belonged to it.
What do you think, Sherry?
That's rural Illinois. That's for you.
What about you, Sherry? Chicago. I mean, that's where most of the films were set in Chicago, correct?
Yeah.
John Hughes film.
That's where most of them were set. It's interesting that you ask that. I don't know that there was any one John Hughes movie that was especially representative. I thought he was good at understanding 80s teenagers.
Okay.
And I thought that was good. I don't know that the actual plot lines were anything that we could relate to broadly.
Mm-hmm.
However, growing up suburban, I do remember a lot of those movies were a big hit. Of course, at that time, there were cattle calls. And so half of us ran to be extras in these movies anyway. My husband grew up in Western Illinois, and he said flat out, and he's core, he was born in 1968. He said flat out, those did not reflect his teen years in the 80s growing up in Western Illinois. So perhaps the proximity to the city, and when you live that close to such a large metropolitan area, just by default, there's a variety of demographics, there's a variety of economic statuses, and a lot of those movies, even when you get into things like Pretty in Pink or I think 16 Candles had this a little bit too, the rich neighborhoods and the middle income neighborhoods and the working class neighborhoods. I think by default that just exists the closer you get to a larger metropolitan area. And that those economic differences, I will say, probably imprinted on my psychology a little bit more than, or I should say a lot more than my husband.
In Breakfast Club, there's something that really hit me at one point where they're talking about, like, at the very end, they were all in these different groups and they didn't get along. And then they bonded, and then they're like, well, you're not going to talk to me Monday, and I'm not going to talk to you. And like that seemed to like hit home with me, because I felt like there were people that in my school, especially older, that would be true for, like, that I could bond with them, and then the next day they would just be like, no, I'm not friends with him.
Yeah.
Were there other movies that you felt were more representative? Were there other movies you felt might be more representative?
Are you talking about?
I think the best one that represented my high school was my high school experience, or at least how it felt, was 10 Things I Hate About You.
Okay.
That's my movie, and it's barely, but if I had to pick one, I would say 10 Things.
If I felt just the feeling of it.
Yeah, just a feeling. I wouldn't even say it's representative, but just a feeling. I'm sorry, I'm answering for you, but we're twins, so.
Going back, if I could, just real quick on the opposite side of that, the older side of that, I'm not really sure that I've ever seen a movie that reflected my high school experience. And maybe this is more about me than anything else, but to me, an Xer movie is The Bad News Bears.
Good, I'm glad you brought that up.
I mean, they're younger kids and stuff, but that movie, when I finally saw it, I'm like, yeah, that one got it. For kids anyway.
What about all the horror
kids.
movies? The horror movies that came out.
That's fun.
Teenage horror movies. Or
I
Breaking
was not
Away.
into those.
Okay.
I was
Breaking
never
Away.
into
I love
those.
Breaking Away. But again, that was a little bit older.
Okay.
Those people were a little bit older than me, but I loved Breaking Away. Great film.
Well,
I was never
there wasn't a lot of-
entertained. I just didn't find people getting chopped up entertaining.
I don't get it either, Amy. Yeah.
I don't like
I
war
was
movies.
never into them. I could
Yeah.
care less.
But
Yeah.
they
I
became
can't.
popular in the 80s. Who?
Yeah,
so do you
I
feel the
don't
demo
know.
was a little bit younger?
Well, no, I'm like, wasn't like Kubrick and they the horror movies were.
Oh, you're going
Big for a
highbrow
long time.
horror.
70s.
I mean, you know, all the Freddy Krueger stuff and Halloween.
Yeah.
I mean, I know they were popular, so someone was watching them,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
Friday the 13th.
What I liked about them as a teenager, I can't watch them now, but as a teenager was that it got my anxiety going. It got me, you know, actually feeling something.
Mhm.
And I think that was a big part of like where I was, you know, and the partying and everything. It's like, it was always about trying to feel something. Plus,
Mm.
you'd go with a guy and it was an easy way to, you know, like jump into the guy's arms without being too forward.
Mm.
You know? So it worked really well on a date situation.
the first movie that I saw that I thought, that is my experience, I know the people in that movie, was Michael Moore's Roger and Me.
Oh,
And
okay.
and I was like, okay, that's the even though it didn't take place in the town that I grew up in, that was my teenage experience.
What
You
about
know, going
Roseanne on
through-
TV?
Living in a Rust Belt town where everyone was out of work, and you know, it was very, you know, depressing, and you know, just the town just dying around me. And that was my, you know, all my friends' parents, you know, there was no teenage job at the mall to go to because my parents were my friends' parents were delivering newspapers and working at McDonald's, and
I think
that was my high school experience. So when I saw that, I'm like, wow, someone actually made a movie about what real life is like. And then I found out later that no, that was just in certain parts of the country.
Right. There were two kinds of Americas.
Mm.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, and I guess there is today, and there was in the 50s, and there maybe there's always been.
You talked about feeling, how horror movies made you feel something. How did music play into this?
You know, again, because the stoner background and all of that, we were heavy metal. I mean, as a teenager, I went to the Whiskey A Go-Go in Hollywood, and you know, we would party up in the hills in Rancho Palos Verdes with rock bands, but my experience, I know, is not a typical experience. I just happened to be where I lived. But, you know, the heavy metal, I think I was just kind of into it because everybody else was. But in reality, I love Journey and more, you know, class. Billy Joel, to this day, I love Billy Joel. He was my first 8-track tape, was Billy Joel. So, you know,
I'm with Kelly on that one.
Yeah, I was the youngest, again, of all my siblings. My baby boomer siblings were 7, 8, 9, and 10 years older than me.
Mm-hmm.
So I had their music influencing a lot of what I liked and enjoyed.
We were listening to Billy Joel, Bob Seger,
Yes.
Journey.
Yeah.
That's REO Speedwagon.
Yes, saw them all in concert.
John Mellencamp. You know, that was the music that we listened to.
Cougar. He was Cougar back then.
He was Cougar. Yes.
Cougar,
yes.
what does that mean?
Well, John Cougar was his stage
Oh,
name.
okay.
Yeah,
I got
and
you.
I've seen that, you know, Tom Petty, Bruce Springsteen,
Okay.
all that stuff. I've seen it referred to as Heartland music. I don't know
Okay.
if that's correct or
So
not.
you guys didn't refer to it as Heartland music.
No,
Okay,
it was
okay.
just what we listened to.
It's rock and roll.
What did you
Rock
listen
and
to,
roll,
Stephen?
yeah.
Stephen, what did you
We
listen to?
didn't listen to punk rock.
I was going to say that music was definitely a huge part of Gen X growing up. And one thing to think about is that when we were young, when we were teenagers, if we wanted to be somewhere in our own space, in the house, in our room by ourselves, we could listen to music, but that was it. We didn't have an internet. We didn't have a computer. Most of us didn't even have a television. So music was our one thing that we had for ourselves. And I think that the culture of the popular music of the 70s and the 80s was a big part of life for Gen Xers. And also, when you were young, you always wanted to be in a band. It seemed like everybody wanted to be in a band, and there was always live music. And then we got into your college years, there would be people out camping, playing live music, and just always parties with live music.
I think that the one thing that Xers are the most passionate about is music. They will sit and argue about music for like 12 hours, you know, like how people argue.
As we got older, I know a lot of especially the guys, they still stayed in garage bands. I mean, they're 40, 50 years old, and they're still playing, you know, at honky-tonk bars and stuff. You know?
Well, the other thing we had, and I think this was, you know, probably one of the things that divided Generation X, because it's a big generation, and I don't think it can be like every generation. I don't want to make it sound like it's special.
We are.
We're okay. We can't be universally described like, oh, Xers are this. They like this kind of music. I think there were certain things that happened that were very, very specific. I think that if you graduated high school before 1984, you were a certain kind of Xer. If you graduated high school after 1984, that's sort of a different color. Where you spent most of your teen years, and specifically for Gen X, how old were you when MTV arrived?
Bingo.
I was in 7th grade, and it hit right at the time when I was starting to discover my own music anyway. And MTV was a huge part of, I mean, I don't want to get too compartmentalized, but for core Xers, MTV was a distinct presence. Very
I think it was for Xers in general.
And you mentioned 1984. I mean, that's when Madonna started to, I wouldn't say she peaked, but that's when she really started to find her niche, right?
I remember Madonna on the MTV commercials, and before, as they were trying to get the television stations to, you know, and it was, I want my MTV, and she was a big, you know, I want my MTV. So she wasn't even a video star as of yet, but she really pushed that genre to get the music videos going.
Yeah. We also had. No, I'm sorry.
I wanted to ask you, Sherry, about what you think accounts for that distinction and between before 1984 and after, and what the differences you think are. Yeah. If you have any thoughts.
I would have to answer that. I would have to dip into Strauss and Howe language, and I'm
please do.
Yeah.
Give me a reason to hashtag Strauss and Howe. Neil's going to be on this show one day.
You can do that anyway, you know.
Thank you.
Right? There's 4 turnings to a cycle. The second turning ended in 1984 or 1983. I forget how they define it. And that's a really hard thing to try and write down on paper with bullet points. Like, well, how do you know this turning ended and the next one began? And all I can do is go into my memories and say, well, I can remember certain things. I remember starting junior high and things were still very clearly in the second turning. The way we dressed, the way we talked, the way we did our hair, the way that the kind of music people were listening to. I remember entering junior high and people were still wearing t-shirts that said disco sucks, which was that's so ridiculous, but they did. They had these shirts. The following year, when I was in 8th grade, Michael Jackson's Thriller came out. MTV became much more pop culture oriented, and the music changed, the fashion changed, the hairstyles changed, and it really was like a switch flipped. I wish I could offer something more specific than that.
Oh, that was great.
That's beautiful.
I think Sherry just figured something out as I'm listening to you and what you said about the graduation year. I think that's where you get the difference between a Joneser and an Xer. That may be the line.
And Stranger Things somehow captures this, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Definitely.
I believe, like 1984, when it first starts out in the first season, I think you see a little bit of the 70s. My perception of the 70s still lingering. And then around like the season that took place in 1984, that's when you start to see mall culture coming in.
Absolutely.
Some of the stereotypes of MTV peaking in 1984 seems to be a year. 1987 seems to be another year too, feeling wise. 84, that's when Bad came out. Like if I was to compare Thriller with Bad, that's post Janet Jackson Control.
Footloose was 84.
Yeah, that's when we start to get at. I don't want to make this too much about my experience, but that's when I think like the R&B scene went from it started to get more into what's called New Jack Swing. It started to have more of a hip hop vibe around 87 and 88.
Yeah, and then also, of course, Michael Jordan, huge phenomenon.
Right.
Even with hip hop music, it going international like 84 and 85, that's another thing. So you just see across all these different areas, like Sherry was saying, it seems like the culture just flipped over pretty much in every area.
Well, and I think that was also at the exact same year that we discovered AIDS, and it started to become. Wasn't it 84 that it really it hit the public awareness? Anyways, I mean, maybe it was there before.
It was shifts. Yeah, 81 is when it was named. My birthday, honestly. No, June 5th, 1981 is when it was, I think, officially called AIDS. I'm not sure. But
I don't know, but
that's the birthday. But I think the public awareness when like Reagan officially.
1981 was it.
But then when Reagan officially made.
I was a senior in high school when someone said, there's this weird, and that would have been 83. Yeah. When someone said there's this weird disease that if you have sex, you die.
Yeah, I was still in college, so it was there.
That was how it was introduced to you. There's a weird disease.
Yeah, basically it's like, and I saw pictures of someone who had it before and someone after they ended that. Yeah, that's, and I'm like, wow, that sounds weird.
I learned about it from like Magic Johnson.
Magic Johnson, yes.
I was gonna ask because the rough, pop history that I heard was that AIDS really became a lot more people became more aware and took it more seriously when Rock Hudson died.
Yes,
in 85.
that's true. Yes, that is absolutely the case.
And Magic Johnson.
I think a lot of people did not even think that Rock Hudson could possibly be gay.
Right.
And that was also a big shocker.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember that.
And then when Magic Johnson got it, like, whoa, okay, that's a sports star.
And
I was
before that they thought it was only a gay people's disease.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And then so like a lot of the NBA players, they were like, I don't want to play with him.
Yeah.
And there's some people who were like who doubted his sexuality and things like that. And
I remember
I'm a big Magic Johnson fan.
So. And I remember after that moment, that's when all of a sudden, at least in the hip hop and R&B community, all of a sudden there was an explosion of safe sex. The safe sex message definitely was prevalent in music from TLC. Left Eye wore the condom on her eye. So the MTV Wrap It Up campaign, was that MTV?
I don't remember that.
This is getting more into late 90s. But
there's a lot of art that just they put condoms on art.
So can I going back to AIDS, do you feel that AIDS killed the free sex culture of the 70s for you guys?
Oh, absolutely.
Oh yeah. Yeah, definitely.
Or free love, for.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, because it was scary. It was scary. And then you're all sitting there and they told you, anyone who you had sex with everybody they had sex with, and then you're like, oh my God. It was scary. And I think a lot of us, when we first became aware of AIDS, knew that we had not been practicing safe sex. And we all kind of walked around going, I think there was a little bit of, for everyone, a little bit of worry. Could I have this? It was scary.
Wow, I would like how does that compare to the coronavirus pandemic? You just don't know who has it. Was there almost a witch hunt or?
I think that there was, I think it was similar in that, like the coronavirus, we really didn't understand it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I'm talking about, yeah, eventually we did, but in the very early stages, you know, it was just supposed to be gay people that got it.
Right.
Just like with the coronavirus, it was just supposed to be old people that died,
Yep.
you know?
Exactly.
And we weren't really sure exactly how it was spread initially.
Mm-hmm.
You know, people were afraid to touch someone who had AIDS because you might, you know, there was a lot of misinformation. And maybe it wasn't misinformation, it was just lack of, you know, understanding. But yeah, I think that there's a lot of parallels, actually.
What do you
Even
think,
in the
Jared?
90s, they were talking about HIV possibly being transmitted by sweat. Like,
Oh,
like
Lord.
it went into my child, like where I was in middle school, where they're still trying to figure AIDS out.
Was there more
Yeah.
information out by the time you got into high school and college?
Oh
Sherry?
yeah,
Well, Sherry,
Yeah.
well, definitely for us. Like,
Yeah.
I feel like we, on the other side of that, I think that's when the promise ring culture started to come in.
yeah. I was thinking the exact
Yeah,
same thing.
Just
that
just
they,
don't
like,
have sex at all.
complete the other way.
Yeah,
The only 100% way is abstinence. or
yeah.
something.
Abstinence became really big.
Yeah. Oh, but you know what? Before AIDS, we did have herpes.
We
And
did.
that was like the first STD that you couldn't, you know, take some medicine to get rid of.
Mm.
So
That was the boomers version. That was the boomers got herpes and then Gen X got AIDS.
No.
yeah, so I think that, like, you know, herpes was kind of, but you thought anyways, well, I'll be able to see that, right? It's visible.
Mhm.
Right.
All right, Darius. So tell us about this chart right here.
Right. So they asked
Pew Research.
by generation, Pew Research, they asked what were the 10 historic events that occurred in your lifetime that have had the greatest impact on the country. And of course, the generations share September 11th or, the election of Barack Obama, but particularly Xers here. I see that the end of the Cold War is high up on the list, along with the Challenger disaster. And I just wanted to ask, obviously, I wasn't born when those things happened. And I really haven't heard too much about them from my parents either. So I was just wondering if you guys had any stories and if that did have a huge impact on you or the people around you.
Which
Yeah.
which part have the huge
The
impact?
Berlin Wall. Yeah, the end of the Cold War. All that was 1989, and you know it began kind of with the Tiananmen Square,
Mhm.
and it just kind of progressed from there. It was amazing just during that whole summer and fall to watch all these countries throwing off communism. You had East Germany, you had Czechoslovakia, you had, Romania, and you had, Ceausescu being executed on Christmas Day or Christmas Eve or whatever it was. It was just an amazing cascade of events. And I think it gets underplayed a lot, but I remember it all very vividly.
I think that my general feeling was, oh, good. So that means we're not going to die. We're not going to get nuked. Okay, we don't have to worry about that now.
You mentioned, Amy, you mentioned a nuke in 1983. The movie The Day After came out.
Oh, that was freaky. Yeah,
Yeah.
that was
That was an
upsetting.
impact movie.
They showed me that in
impacted me.
science class, and they scared me to death. Because that happened it was Lawrence, Kansas was where that's located.
Yeah.
And I'm in Missouri, so like I'm like, what? And then the science teacher's like telling me why they would blow up Kansas City.
Yeah, they sent
the strategy of it. I'm like, what?
They sent letters home with all the kids from school saying to the parents, yeah, this is really graphic, but we want you to watch this with your kids. You know, they were like encouraged. My school district encouraged that they wanted us kids to watch it, and it was scary.
Yeah, they didn't tell my parents.
Kelly, what is your experience with the movie? You had.
I think it was just very impactful, and the whole idea, the same thing. It's like we grew up going doing the bomb shelter thing, like now you do the active shooter drills. We would go under the desk, and it was the same drill if we had earthquakes. And so so in '83, I'm kind of graduating, and but that movie came out, and then I met and married a Marine. So, the war and the whole military thing just kind of continued after that. But I remember saying during those eras, the things that I was most afraid of was nuclear war, tidal waves, and earthquakes. And I lived on the coast in California, married to a Marine, But I think it definitely had an impact. I think it really changed our generation to like, this has got to stop.
The Cold War. The Cold
War.
And
War, the game War Games. Does anybody relate to War Games and how that, to me, that really impacted me as well?
I watched War Games as a kid, but even that got into my head. Like, yeah, there's no mutually assured destruction. It's something I knew from as a 8-year-old.
I even referenced it on a post about my finances yesterday. I referenced War Games, so it definitely fits. The only way to win the game is not play it.
I don't remember the Cold War era. I just remember G.I. Joe, maybe, Mr. T.
And the whole,
cartoon
Mad Maxian movies, that came out after that was, it was just so, it was so seeped within our culture. There was
Rambo.
And
even
and
Rocky.
there was, I'm talking about the post-apocalyptic movies,
Right.
and even in the music, it was there. They were singing about it. I remember Sting had this song, I hope the Russians love their children too. It was just everywhere. And it was scary.
I wanted to point out the music, like the song, you gotta wear, Future So Bright, you gotta wear shades. That's just like a cynical song about nuclear war, that we're gonna die. If we don't stop this, we're all gonna die.
I think that I don't know if I speak for most Xers, but I kind of feel like maybe I do. For Xers, it wasn't like if it was going to happen, but when it was going to happen.
Yeah, we've talked about that on the group before. Like, our generation has always been waiting for the apocalypse.
Yeah, and so now it's like with the coronavirus, it's like, oh, this is the apocalypse? Well, that's not how it was supposed to happen.
This is the apocalypse on easy mode. This is the easy mode apocalypse.
Asteroid or something. What do you mean pandemic? This was not the apocalypse we've been expecting.
I love apocalypse movies.
Yeah.
I mean, when Corona came out, it was like, okay, let me rewatch all the apocalypse movies. It's a big reason when Trump got elected, I moved to Mexico because I knew that something really bad was going to happen.
You actually moved. Everybody talks about moving to Canada.
Country.
You actually did.
Oh, wow.
So it's the end of the world as we know it. The REM song, is that?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it was only a matter of time.
Okay.
So I think, with this pandemic, Xers are kind of like, well, we've been expecting it. We just didn't know it was going to look like this. So
we'll deal with it.
I think Xers are better suited than any other generation to deal with the situation, to be honest. I think we've been ready for this our whole lives.
I agree.
Did you guys anticipate toilet paper shortage for the apocalypse?
no.
I wrapped all the toilet paper out of
First buy all the toilet paper.
Even all of this still isn't as graphic or as bad, I think, as Xers are waiting for.
Yeah.
It's like, really, we need to stay home, and there's going to be some financial struggle. Okay, like you're still waiting for the other shoe to drop.
Mm-hmm.
And
That's when they sent in the murder hornets. Because it wasn't enough yet. I'm worried when I hear all of this stuff about the coming depression and how it could rival the depression of the 1930s. I'm more worried about what that means for my children. My son, who's supposed to graduate from college in another year, and will it still be bad when my kid that is in high school? I'm more worried about what it means for them than myself.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I mean, I don't love the worry, but I have noticed a pattern of you guys of Generation X being very worried for the future generation, their kids.
Yeah.
Does that come from caring about your care for your kids? Is that reacting to maybe feeling that older generation didn't care for you guys when you were younger?
Exactly. Yeah.
I think that's something that I admire about the millennials and my children being millennials. My son is Army, and so he's financially, actually, I had to borrow money from him. He had to support me through this. And then my daughter is former Air Force and a cybersecurity expert. And but I think they're very like conservative in their thinking. They're very I'm not concerned. I know that there's going to be rough times ahead, but I feel like the millennials are much more flexible and they can figure it out. They'll find a way. And the kids that I know, the millennial kids that like the expats that live here, they're like, yeah, well, we're growing our own garden. We'll make our own cheese. Well, they're not worried about scarcity, but they're out there feeding, the locals here. And I admire that about the millennials. I think they're much more flexible and fluid than we give them credit for.
I feel like there is a worry about the future of the economy because definitely with the shutdown, things could get bad in terms of a recession or even worse economically. But I also feel like we have a sense of togetherness that means that we can survive this. I'm sort of a stepdad. I don't have kids of my own, but my partner does. And I feel like even though her boys who are both teenagers might have a hard time finding work in the years coming up because of what's happening, as a family, we'll always be able to rely on one another. So we're going to get through it. I have no worry about that.
Yeah.
So the world has definitely changed a lot from the 80s to now. Are you rolling with it, or are you having a hard time catching up? Do you feel like the world is leaving you behind in your thinking?
Sometimes I feel like my age is getting to me, and I feel like I'm in like the last chapter where I get to do anything. But at the same time, I feel very comfortable in life now as a 53-year-old.
I want to hang with younger people. I find that hanging with younger people, both in real life and online, keeps me younger and keeps me more open in my thinking. There's still much more for me to learn, and I'm learning a lot from younger folks.
I enjoy the relationships that I have with younger people too. I feel like I'm learning from them. So and I'm just glad that they accept me. Let me be a part of the group sometimes.
Have any of y'all been okay boomered?
Yeah, well, that's the thing. You're the boomers putting down the millennials. And I never understood that. I'm like, why are you putting down the millennials? They're a great generation. I mean, when the 2008 crash happened and then you had the wars in Afghanistan and all that going on, my kids, their father went to Iraq. And then my kids couldn't find work when they graduated high school, and they both entered the military because that's all that was available. And then I had 2 children in war zones at the same time. And, it's like to the baby boomers, I'm like, what did you guys do? Look what these kids had to go through. And they're having to make their way. You gave them this shitty world, and now they're having to make their way, and they're doing a pretty awesome job of it. So when I hear them, the baby boomers saying, oh, millennials don't care, or whatever they're saying, what is it, that you guys are selfish?
Entitled is the word.
Entitled.
You guys were called slackers. I didn't even get into that.
No, the Gen X are the slackers.
Okay.
I think we're the slackers. Definitely not millennials.
Did you graduate out of the slacker stereotype, or do you feel you're still slackers?
I'm still
No, work smart, not hard. Work smart.
Sherry? Oh, I'm sorry, I cut you off.
No, I don't think we were ever slackers, ever.
Okay.
No, I don't think there was ever a time. I think that there was, that was
subculture.
Sorry?
A subculture, maybe.
I think that it was an observation of a bunch of teenagers acting like teenagers. And you take the personality of what that very irresponsible time of life is just generally, and say, oh, this is who they are. millennials being entitled. Well, are they, or were they just acting a certain way when they were 18?
Right.
With Xers, it's like, yep, we went to the mall. Were we responsible with money? No, because we were 17 and we didn't really know any better. But slacker to me just means don't care, don't want to try, indifferent. And I did not have people in my world, in my age group, who were that way. And that was always the thing that I felt like I was trying to communicate to people older than me, was that we were misidentified as not caring, when I think actually it was quite the opposite. I think we actually cared very, very deeply. And some of the movies, films, stories that came out in the 90s that began to portray us in our 20s kind of got it, where it's like, no, this is a group of people who feel very deeply. They care very much about relationships. Loyalty is paramount. Your circle of your circle of trust, that's so metaphorical, sorry, but that tight group, that meant everything. And we cared very, very deeply. And it was actually quite easy to break us emotionally. Might not want to show it. We weren't going to let somebody know they got the better of us, and I'm sorry to speak in cliches, but that's kind of what's coming to mind. But truly, I think we felt very deeply, and the way we handle our kids, the way we raise our kids, whether they're millennials or in my case, they're post-millennial, and all of the criticism that we've taken as parents for hovering or being helicopter parents or being snow parents, that's rooted in care. It's not rooted in, it's poorly executed perhaps, but it's truly rooted in a great deal of care. And that's something that I feel like was always overlooked with Xers.
I think that,
Well said.
I think that I'm a slacker, but I also, I'm also an overachiever about the things that I care about, so it makes me kind of conflicted,
Right.
But
to be a slacker and an overachiever at the same time.
Well, okay, then you know what I'm gonna. That's interesting. We're self-deprecating. So
Yes.
it's
Very
we're
true.
just like, okay, fine, we're whatever, we're slackers, we don't.
Whatever is the perfect.
We'll kind of flip that off. Whereas Amy, given your life experience, and I think anybody else sitting here, if we really pulled what some other generations do, and that is offer our resumes all the time, where it's like, look at all the things we did. Nobody here could be called a slacker. Not really when you think about what you were doing at 16, at 20, at 25, at 30. It's like, no, we were invested. We were. I don't recommend people run around showing their resumes because that's kind of arrogant, but that's not the Xer thing. We're not going to do that. We're not going to present everything we've done throughout our lives. If anything, we'll kind of blow it off.
My image of them is that they'll pretty much work or have worked whatever job or gone wherever they need to in order to, make their livelihood. Most of the Xers I know have worked 10, 12, 13 jobs across their lifetime. And I was just wondering, Steve, what your experience was with that.
Yeah, so in my field, I've been mostly working as a contractor. And so what happens is the contracts, they expire, and that forces me to seek another position. So my personal experience of it is that on the one hand, there's a little bit of stress associated with that because I've always had these little stretches of unemployment in between my jobs. But I've very much enjoyed it because I've moved around and worked in so many different organizations and in so many different fields that I've met tons of people, and I've learned how all these different companies work and learned all these different processes, and it's a great personal satisfaction to start at a new position and then work your way up to where you really know what's going on and you're able to be productive and perform well. And the fact that I'm able to do that repeatedly is definitely one of the great job satisfactions of my life. So I would say there's a lot of job satisfaction associated with that approach, but at the same time, you have to be wary there can be stress where you're looking for work, and as I've gotten older, it's gotten harder and harder and harder. And so this is where I've gotten to the life stage where I'm a little bit worried now about ageism. I'm maybe a little bit less hireable now that I'm in my 50s. Am I going to be able to continue doing this into my 60s? You know, that's something I have to wonder about. And
do you feel like it's hard to?
Very important is you have to learn how to manage your money.
Yeah.
When you have to face unemployment, you have to be careful about managing your money. So don't be a slacker about your finances. Definitely not once you get to middle age.
We've moved several times. My husband and I have been married 30 years, and we have moved several times because of his job. You know, because he, you know, the last time it was because he got laid off, and you know, it was like wherever he could find a job, we were going, and we knew that. And so I guess in that respect. And so, you know, I have a hard time with people that are like, well, there's no jobs here. And I think, well, then leave, you know, go where the jobs are, right? That's what you do. And it's you give up a lot. You know, I didn't want to move my kids and, you know, have to start all over again in life, but that's what you do. So I guess in that sense, you know, S&H call us nomads, and so I guess
Strauss and Howe.
Yeah, Strauss and Howe, the authors of Generations Fortuna. They call us nomads, and I guess when I look at my adult life, yeah, I have been, and it's because we went where the jobs were. That was, you know.
Do you guys feel like the middle?
Whole reason for moving.
Do you guys feel like the middle child?
Really quick, I just wanted to ask Steve, do you feel like you've encountered any ageism yet, or is that just a concern you have that may come on the horizon?
That's good.
You know, I'm not entirely sure.
Okay, yeah, I was thinking you might not even necessarily know, and it might just be like if you hadn't. I guess my question was, did you ever get that feeling that perhaps ageism was playing a role in something? And again, anybody else can feel free to, but just because you brought it up, I was wondering.
Yeah. My husband, but I think it might be more about my anxiety about it than anything else.
Okay.
Steve, my husband says the same thing. Right. He worries. Now, yeah, he's 56, and he does say, "Oh, I think these millennials, you know, they're going to try and take my job," and I don't know.
It's a reason why I got out of the corporate world anyway. It's like I knew I had to like make my own work because I knew that, you know, there was ageism coming up, you know, and I wasn't young and thin and cute anymore. And it's like, you know, all my experience, you know, I worked my way through and got an MBA, and it mattered nothing. Nobody cared. And I'm like, are you kidding me? So it was like, okay, well then screw it all. I'm going to sell my house and, you know, start my own business in Mexico.
How do you think Gen Xers will be remembered? There's the future of Strauss and Howe are writing a book on the Gen X 13th generation. How do you think your generation will be remembered?
I think we're gonna be remembered by like the Sarah Palins and the Paul Ryans.
Oh God, I hope not.
I hate to say that. That's not who I want to be remembered by, but yeah, they seem to be. Yeah, I'm afraid that's
Sarah Palin? From Slacker to Sarah Palin. Really?
Yeah.
Well, remember whenever the Tea Party? Oh, sorry.
Sherry, would you like to?
Oh, I had just said I think it depends on who's writing the memoir, you know?
Right.
I think that boomers, whatever view they had of us in 1986, that's their view of us now. Whatever view millennials have of us when they were in their early 20s will be the view they have of us. So I'm hoping that our kids will recall us fondly. That's my greatest hope. I don't know if this is an Xer thing or if it's a Sherry thing or if it's just a human condition, but I can't change the opinion of anybody. There isn't a single person alive whose opinion I can change. I certainly can't change the way an entire generation is viewed, but I do hope that my kids, at the very least, recall me fondly. And so whatever it is they have to say, you know,
I am quite sure that they will.
Do you guys feel like you're the parents that are here? Do you feel like you're friends with your kids? Because I feel like I'm friends with my kids.
I'm
Absolutely.
friendly. Yeah. I mean, I'm friendly with them. I want them to trust me. You know, I want to be more than their friend, though. I want to be their parent. I want to be somebody that they would go to for guidance. But we're friendly. We're silly. You know, we're ridiculous with each other. But I also respect that there's a boundary. You know, they're going to be friends with their peers. But I want them to love me and connect to me.
Well, like Sherry was saying, more of an advisor role now, which I think is normal. And you know, when your kids get to a certain age, they don't need parenting so much as they just need somebody and to give them wise advice and that. And then you can only do that if they ask. You know, I definitely don't insert my views on what they're doing, but because I don't, they come to me.
Are there any final thoughts as far as music? I didn't even mention Kurt Cobain. I didn't even feel like it was going to organically come up in this conversation. I feel like that's not part of this wave.
But isn't it funny that, okay, Ryan, when you asked us about the music, that was not one of the people that we listed.
It stayed in the 80s, and I love that. That's what I love, trying to get to the bottom of the stereotype, because I think your wave of Xers has been replaced by the ones that were maybe in their 20s and the 90s. Who grew up with the hip hop and the grunge and
yeah, I was in my 20s. I was in my 20s in the 90s.
So was Kurt Cobain some part of your worldview, the landscape?
Kurt Cobain, I feel, was more so my brother, who was born in 75. When Kurt Cobain died, I was already working. It was, you know, post college. I was working, and it wasn't that you weren't sad that it happened. You know, you can have that extension of sympathy, but as far as it like rocking my world and really being something that was horrifying, no. But I think it was more so my brother's age group. You know, people born 74 through 77, maybe. Yeah,
we'll probably get into the Zennial territory, because honestly, I don't even remember him dying. Do you, Paul? I remember Biggie and Tupac dying, but not Kurt.
That was like my introduction to the pop cultural idea of Gen X, was Kurt Cobain dying and by apparent suicide, allegedly, that he died of suicide, and that it like Gen X had lost their icon and I wonder if that's kind of like the boomer take on it. That Gen X lost their icon, like if they lost Eric Clapton or something.
It was probably John Lennon for us.
Well, they thought that Kurt Cobain was John Lennon for us. I think that was it, because I'm not saying that Xers weren't sad. Like, you know, it was like, oh man, that's terrible. He killed himself. That's too bad.
Right.
But I don't think that Xers were building shrines to him, you know, after he died.
I would say Michael Jackson and Whitney Houston probably hit me a little bit harder.
The one that really surprised me, and I guess maybe because I'm a little bit older Xer, was when Prince died. And I mean, that seems like that was a bigger loss for Gen X than Kurt Cobain. I was surprised at the reaction by that.
Luke Perry. I don't know if that's 90210.
I just remember, you know, the Xers were just like for days and days and days about Prince, and it was
part of my world. And I saw him in concert, and Prince didn't, you know, that didn't even register in my world.
I was shocked by the outpouring, and
I think I was more shocked by Michael Jackson.
I remember when Carrie Fisher died. That was kind of a big deal. Yeah. Probably most so for the women my age who just remembered Princess Leia. We were like, oh my gosh, that was our princess. Yeah. And I've had to explain that.
2016 was just horrible for deaths. Horrible.
right. I mean, people say how bad 2020 is, but I'm like, oh, well, 2016, everybody was dying, and then Trump was elected, and it was like, you know, the COVID is nothing compared to 2016. You know?
Yeah, it felt like pop culture died.
I wouldn't speak too
2016.
soon about
Yeah, it was
2020.
like the year's not over.
Yeah.
Poor TY. But culturally, I do feel like 2016 is when pop culture, the one that we all grew up with, died.
Yeah.
And
I just want to point out that those were all boomers who died.
yeah.
Well, Muhammad Ali died that year, right? He was a silent, right?
Um,
Well,
Is he
who
not
else-
before?
It was a silent Jen.
Got to fact check. Thank you guys for coming together. This is a great conversation, and definitely understanding the nuance between the Xers. It seems like with the millennials, I felt like there was a little bit of a consensus. With the boomers, I felt like there was a consensus like, oh, wow, this is our generational experience. With the Xers, it seems like it's a little bit more gray, and I love that. I appreciate that. Thank you guys for coming together.
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay.